Right, good evening everyone. So I'm the managing director of an electronics company called Solid State Logic, which is based just outside Oxford. We employ about 140 people locally, and we make equipment for the music and broadcast industries. Equipment is manufactured here in the UK, and we export about 90% of our output, about 25% of it to other EU countries. So in my career with the company, I've built much of our international distribution network, and I travel regularly to Europe, the USA, Japan, and other industrialized countries. In recent months, I've attended a number of meetings with the Thames Valley's Chambers of Commerce and other business-oriented groups concerned about Brexit. So I'm sure you've heard many times businesses saying that they want stability and predictability. The government has exhorted businesses to prepare for Brexit, but when the CBI or the FSB or the Chambers of Commerce say, what sort of Brexit should we prepare for, there's no coherent answer. Why is there no coherent answer? Well, one, because the government doesn't appear to have a coherent view of what it can realistically achieve, and two, because it's in the middle of a negotiation anyway, and by its very nature can't know what the outcome will be. So this leaves businesses in an uncertain position, the very, very thing that they like least. You'll also have heard how some large companies, including some from the finance sector, are starting to move some of their operations to European centres. This is not an option for the vast majority of UK companies whose employees and their skills are their most valuable asset. In all of the meetings I've attended, and I've been to quite a few with other business leaders, I haven't heard a single voice that thinks that leaving the EU is a good idea. So business really does have a unified voice about this. In my own company, in order to sustain our main source of competitive advantage, we've recruited graduates and postgraduates from other EU countries, many of them into our 50-strong R&D team. These people, specialists in their fields, are important to our continued success. In the past year, we've lost 3 of them, who've returned to their home countries, citing Brexit as a contributory factor in their decision. Even more worrying is the huge decline we've seen in job applications from other EU countries. We seem to have already poisoned the well. Oxfordshire is one of the country's leading technology centres. Technological collaboration and the ability to recruit specialists from a wider pool than is available in the UK are absolutely essential to our ability to contribute both at a local and a national level. Not surprising then that Oxford was one of the strongest Remain voting areas in the country. Now, recently there's been a lot of focus on the idea that some form of break from the EU that allows the UK to stay in a customs union might be a practical compromise. Let me just say very clearly that anything that removes the UK's ability to trade freely across borders with other EU countries would be nothing short of catastrophic. The current customs clearing system is already at the limit of its capacity for the number of transactions it can process. The massive increase that would occur if the UK was outside a customs union with the EU would bring our ports to a virtual standstill. An expert in this field told me that it would take up to 5 years and a great deal of money to implement a new customs system that could cope with the increased demand. After 40 years within the EU, the supply chains of many businesses rely on the smooth operation of cross-channel ports. The delays and additional costs and paperwork that would come with a departure from the customs union would make a significant number of UK businesses unviable, with consequent job losses. Now, the UK has already got the slowest growth of most EU economies, largely because of the fallout from the Brexit vote. Every version of Brexit that's been discussed is forecast to compound this impact on this country's economic performance. If there is an exit from the EU, this will not only affect businesses and jobs, but the government's ability to fund the NHS, social care, education, infrastructure, etc., etc. You may have noticed that I said if there's an exit. I am enough of an optimist to believe that the practical obstacles, let alone the sheer stupidity, will cause the project to be abandoned. So I hope for all our sakes I'm right, and if you're sat here asking yourself, what can I do about it? I recommend voting in the council elections for candidates who have clearly expressed their support for overturning the collective madness that we're currently having to endure.
Thanks very much, Anthony. So, I mean, the latest figure on GDP, as you've mentioned, is 0.1% growth for the first quarter in 2018, which was far below projections, which to begin with were already pretty low given where we are. So it is, the UK is now by far, and it gives no one pleasure to say this, the slowest growing economy in the G7. But again, in the spirit of kind of asking slightly less favourable questions here, if we were to move to a form by which we have regulatory divergence, are there any areas that businesses that you're familiar with would identify as areas where being not subject to EU regulation might benefit them competitively internationally?
I can't think of one to answer your question directly. I think one of the things that you might be interested to be aware of is that the contribution of UK experts to the creation of standards within the EU is very widely recognised within the other countries in the EU. If we depart the Union and start to adopt different standards, we're going to create a massive bureaucracy of then trying to have our products and services matching EU regulations when we want to export back to the EU. So it is a complete minefield. I often think about the whole EU process as far as it affects business as an iceberg. You can see the top bit of all of the problems, but believe you me, underneath the surface there is another 9 times as many problems that aren't immediately obvious.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anthony, and of course we'll return both to the issue of customs union and the way in which we might exit from Brexit at the what next stage. So thanks for the primer on that as well. So again, as per earlier, I invite contributions, and there are plenty. So we'll walk from yes. All right, we'll come back to you first.
Hello there, my name is Tom. I work for a company called Sophos. It's a cybersecurity company. Brexit will not have a good impact on that company. It's not having an immediate impact, but it employs a lot of people across Europe, quite a high percentage. It's a very high-skilled tech company, and it's not going to have a good impact. I think the top brass in our company is already starting to look at Abingdon as a potential, which is where the company is based, as a potential weak spot company because of Brexit. So that's just that statement. But I did have a question, and it was, I would have thought that the Conservative government would probably involve lots of people from lots of different demographics, but the one kind of body of organisations or people they would probably strongly listen to would be businesses, large businesses and banks, financial corporations, etc. But it seems to me they're blind to even that. So I'd be interested to hear what the panel think about that.
That's great. I'll come back to you earlier, but later rather.
Following on from that, you say you don't know of others in similar positions to yourself who support Brexit. My basic question follows on. How representative are the organisations for employers? During the referendum debate, and I was then chairman of the European Movement branch here, we organised a similar meeting to this. The Federation of Small Business would not answer letters inviting them to have somebody on the panel. When we had a debate, they wouldn't take part in the debate. CBI clearly is being more critical. But the other employers' organisations, are they speaking out on this issue? are you representing, or is this a local phenomenon? Do you think you can speak for colleagues with employers of 140 like yourselves nationwide? Are they all feeling the same? And do their organisations really represent your views?
Okay, perfect. There was one other hand at the back, or two now, yes. Yeah, I can see that. Thank you.
I know it's all about discussing the impact of Brexit today, but it's actually beginning to depress me quite significantly this evening. So I was wondering if the perfect scenario arrives and we get a second referendum, which is what a lot of people are campaigning for, how do we make the message so positive that they get it right next time?
Okay, we may save this very important question till the final stage, if that's all right, of the evening. There was one other question I thought at the, yes, Karen, if you can see, at the very end there, yes. And then I'll come back to the front.
Okay, sorry to be a bit depressing, but I just want to say I'm very depressed by all this. But I actually had a market research company and we operated globally and we particularly worked out in Europe. And you hear all the Brexiteers talking about how liberated we will be to be able to trade globally. Well, I was trading very happily through Europe, and because we were so strong in Europe, we could then operate globally, because my biggest client was Unilever, and it was very obvious to all of us that Unilever were definitely going to be leaving the UK after Brexit, although they wanted to deal with the government to pretend it was a variety of other things. So in the end, all the headwinds that were coming at us, including post-recession, technology, etc. Brexit for me was the big tipping point, and I actually closed my business because all the budgets and all the decision making was coming out of Rotterdam and Hamburg now, not out of London. London was like the most dominant area in market research and advertising services, which is the world I operate in. But frankly, I saw the writing on the wall and I closed the business. And one thing, building on what other people are saying, is I'm not a conservative, but I did think surely the Conservatives would care about business. So what I'm interested in is, are you speaking to your local MPs who are, I don't know if they're Tory or not, but do they care? Do they seem to mind the fact that all these businesses are going to be in deep, deep trouble and not paying their taxes or whatever? But that's my question. So a sad story on one side, and also my son is planning to go to Berlin as fast as he can, if he's allowed to go, because I presume some of these people who are too young are going to get stuck here and can't escape. So very depression all round, but we are fighting, because look at my t-shirt, and we are Oxford for Europe, so we're still trying.
Great. There are two further questions here. I think we'll then have to leave it at that, but we might return to other questions at the final stage, or well, the penultimate stage, rather.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to ask a question which has partly been asked of already again. That is, why if business is voting Remain on a large scale, why are they not shouting from the rooftops about it? I was in Brussels 3 weeks ago, speaking to some businesses there. I asked that same question, and the reply I got was very puzzling. They said that they did not want to frighten people.
It's a very good question. And then finally, yes, please.
Okay, I'll try to keep this quiet. This is going to be brief, sorry. This will probably join up everything we've just been talking about now. I've worked in the private and public sectors for a long time. Currently, project manager. I've worked with 3,000 project managers for the government. To get anything to a business case, anything large, takes about 2-3 years just to get to a business case. So any of the decisions that we need to be making for custom systems, IT systems, board protection, everything, none of that is even going to be in the design stage for 2 years. So once we get to the design stage and actually having it put into build stage, that's when they've actually made a decision. You're looking at a minimum of 5 years to actually get it to beta stage. So anything that we think we're going to be able to do in the timescales we have is a problem. We put that into the private sector, sorry, the public sector. Any company that's trying to create a business case for actually having a continuity plan for what's happening, how we're going to deal with Brexit, you need to be thinking way ahead. Someone like Airbus needs to be thinking 5 or 10 years ahead. If you're going to have to move all your infrastructure, or like you're saying, your staff, retrain them, teach them different languages, whatever, you can't do that until the government's made a decision. So if the government's going to take 10 years to actually get to that level, that's going to be a huge problem. My last point, Labour, as we all know, are saying we can leave everything to the last minute. If we do that, it will be catastrophic on a level that nobody has any clue about. Now, I just want to say very, very briefly, going back to my work in government at the moment, when I first started working there, I was stunned that nobody knew what an interdependency was in the project. Nobody had considered working between different projects, how they work together. And there was nobody in the government that is working on Brexit now that's looking at every sector because they have no knowledge whatsoever of what they're supposed to be doing and building a model because it is too complex. It will take 10 years to build a model which will give a rough idea of what Brexit will do.
So we've got questions about long-term planning, about why business isn't making noise, about how you utilize local MPs, about whether what you're saying is representative of various business groupings, and more generally about how this affects businesses. Quite a lot.
Yeah, let me just take the last point first, because I completely agree with you. And it's actually that very reason that I think makes the whole Brexit thing totally impractical, which is why it'll never happen. The number of comments about business not being listened to, you're entirely wrong. The government is listening very carefully to the business concerns of Rupert Murdoch, Paul Dacre, and the Berkshire brothers. Unfortunately, it's not listening to the rest of business, and that is a matter of shame and embarrassment to someone who comes from that community. I was at a meeting recently in Reading at the headquarters of Microsoft with about 25 other business people, most of them from big companies, and I was doing my best to stick up for SMEs. And this very question was debated there, and a lot of people in the room who spoke up about the madness of Brexit under the Chatham House rule, when challenged about why they weren't going to put their heads up above the parapet, cited their HR departments, their marketing departments, their CEO, their blah, 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 about why they didn't want to put their heads above the parapet because it wouldn't be good for business. This is useless, frankly, and people from the business sector really, really do need to stand up. Now, I'm also embarrassed to say that I don't think the CBI or the FSB have done a very good job either. I'm particularly cross about the CBI because they do have the clout. The FSB has never been particularly strong in its sort of campaigning, but the CBI definitely does have the voice of government, and it's not getting listened to. One of the last meetings I attended had two representatives from BEIS at the meeting. These are civil servants at a sort of middle level who were there to listen and take the message back. And I got talking to them after the meeting and I said, okay, so what happens when you take all this back to your ministers? And they say, well, yes, we do take it back. But generally, if it's not the message they want to hear, then they just go, nah, 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 and they choose not to listen. So I'm afraid sort of doctrinaire behaviour at the centre of our government is what's blocking it. But the reluctance of businesses to get involved is a matter of concern. And I do what I can, but I think there's a lot more that businesses could be doing. Yeah, I mean, the issue of companies taking their businesses abroad, I think largely this is a luxury that bigger businesses can afford. As I mentioned in my talk earlier, I think most smaller businesses depend on the people, the infrastructure and the skills that they already have, and they just don't have the luxury. I mean, something like 70% of jobs in this country are people employed by SMEs. And while your Unilevers and your Marses and your Nestles and Microsofts might be able to move things abroad, companies like ours just can't do it. We just can't afford to do it. So that's a massive challenge as well.